the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program investigative journalist and author of Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet, Yasha Levine. Yasha, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. So now I guess the Reader's Digest version of the Internet is that Al Gore helped, our military, or I guess it was DARPA, develop it, but it actually started earlier than that, back in the late 50s.
Yeah. I mean, basically, Al Gore created it with his mind from the womb. You know, when he was still developing as a fetus, he was already creating it. No, I mean, look, it started in the 50s as a military project that had its roots in air defense on some level, right? Early warning radar defense system for the United States to protect America from a Soviet nuclear attack by air. And so in the 50s, this entailed creating this first modern computerized radar defense system that featured these giant IBM computers spread around all over America in these nuclear-proof bunkers, and connecting them with a network, and then creating technology that was this first generation kind of workspace desktop computer technology that allowed people watching the radar screen to interact with a digital screen with a early mouse and kind of open menus and things like that. So that was the first national network, and out of that, in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, began the development of the ARPANET, the military network that later on became the Internet. And during the Vietnam War, it had less to do with air defense and more to do with finding ways of fighting insurgencies and figuring out a new kind of approach to fighting warfare, where you're dealing with an unknown kind of battlefield, a different type of enemy that's hiding in plain sight, hiding in among local population in Vietnam and different insurgencies around the world, and figuring out ways of how do you find the insurgent in the civilian population? How do we figure out why they're fighting us, why they're fighting America? So the idea was to study this to study culture, study people, and to try to isolate the kind of the radical part of the population from the more complacent part, and figure out what makes people tick. And so the system that we now know as the Internet was a kind of a foundation that allowed the Pentagon and allowed intelligence agencies to share information that they were collecting from around the world, and to analyze it and to try to help them run and manage a global presence in the age of insurgencies, in the age of nuclear warfare, to get like a bird's eye view of the world.
And so that particular program was the Cambridge Project, right? And this was done out of DARPA. And we should just say that ARPA was the Advanced Research Project Agency, and then it ultimately became DARPA, which I think gives you a sense of like where all of this is heading, right? I mean, at one point it's just research, and then it becomes brought into the State Department. I mean, so, and this was under McNamara had obviously a big reputation as being a data guy, I guess. And and so I mean, just break it down for us a little bit more. Like, how was this supposed to? How were you going to, or how were they hoping, and did it work? This Cambridge Project, that they would be able to isolate where the insurgency, in quotations, is coming from.
Well, yeah. Look, I mean, the Cambridge Project that you're just talking about is actually just a kind of an offshoot of the larger ARPANET project that was run out of ARPA, and there were a number of different projects, and this one was specifically geared at creating a networked sort of infrastructure, a set of tools, a set of databases that could ingest large amounts of data, and into a computer database, and be easy enough to use that anyone could do it, right? That you didn't need specialized training. You didn't need to be a technician in a white lab coat that's, punching IBM cards and then feeding them into a computer, which is how data was fed into computers. And even still then, this is the late '60s, and so it was trying to come up with a modern database, suite of database applications, and that could allow the processing of data, of any kind of data. It could be weather data, for instance, but it could also be data on individuals, on data on let's say anti-war protesters, data on civil rights protesters, data on communist movement in Latin America, or communist movements in Latin America. It could be a database of foreign intelligence intercepts that could be, for instance, fed into this, digitized and searched by anybody connected to the ARPANET network. And so they were the Cambridge Project was, I guess, like an early version of what Palantir is trying to do now, right? Which is give people a tool or a set of tools that can ingest any kind of data, mash it all together, and use it for whatever purposes they have in mind. Whether that's analyzing Wall Street data so you can get the drop on other firms and make investments right before the market moves on them, or you're the CIA and you're trying to comb through phone records, internet records and things like that to find some kind of terrorist network, right? So it's actually, the tool would be agnostic in the sense that it didn't care what kind of data you fed into it, right?
Right.
But because it was connected to the ARPANET and it was being funded by the Pentagon and funded under a military umbrella, the selling point of this particular project that was connected to the ARPANET was that it would give intelligence analysts and military analysts a broad set of generic tools that could allow them to work with data and to use data for whatever purposes they had in mind. And so at the time, when this thing was built, it was started in the late '60s, and it ran through the '70s, and the CIA at the time, called it the most sophisticated data analysis tool that is available to CIA analysts. So you have to remember that general purpose computers didn't really exist back then. General purpose software like Excel spreadsheets and database software didn't exist back then. And so ARPA, and as part of its ARPANET project, was really tasked with developing these things. And so most of the personal computer technology that we're used to today, the desktop computer, the word processor, the database software, the Excel spreadsheet, even like collaborative document editing now that you get with Google Docs and things like that, video conferencing software, that was all developed by ARPA as part of its ARPANET program that then gave us the internet. And so these things are kind of come together. And so, but your other question is, how are they hoping to use this, right? How are they using data at the time, right?
Right.
And I mean, you kind of have to go back in time to the 1960s to understand why they were pursuing this technology. America was, a globally expanding power at the time. It was still kind of new. It was fighting the Soviet Union and this nuclear standoff, but it was also fighting these insurgencies all around the globe. The Vietnam War was central in that, but there were insurgencies that America was involved in, or trying to fight insurgencies all around the globe. Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa, and this is a new kind of warfare because it didn't involve tanks. It didn't involve armies with people marching in formation. So you couldn't really fight it in the same way that you'd fight World War II or the Korean War. This is a warfare that had combatants that were part of the civilian population, and it was not easy to even find out who they were or why they were fighting, what their motivations were. These are regions in which America sometimes didn't really have a historic presence, so they didn't really understand the people it was fighting and who they were, and what was causing all of this. It was kind of naive in that sense, and so they believed that you could if you could understand, if you could gather data about these people, right, about these political movements, about what they believed, what they wanted, about their cultural values, you could more effectively fight them and defeat them on the battlefield, on this new kind of battlefield.
Right. I mean, this is the way to win hearts and minds, right? Like, who knew you needed a computer to tell you that people didn't like to be bombed or something to that effect, I guess. But